Before Dracula ever cast his shadow, Europe was already haunted. Across forgotten villages and plague-stricken towns, the dead were feared not for resting in their graves, but for rising from them. These were not elegant immortals, but bloated corpses, cursed neighbors, and night-creeping spirits blamed for disease, famine, and sudden death. Tonight, we uncover 9 vampires from European folklore, ancient undead legends born from fear, ritual, and forbidden belief. From Slavic gravewalkers to Greek revenants, these are the vampires history tried to bury, but never could. Thank you for watching, for keeping these ancient legends alive, and for walking with us into the darkness. The Upír, Slavic vampire. Long before the word vampire entered Western imagination, Slavic villages already feared the Upír, a being whose very name would echo through centuries of terror. The Upír was not born from Gothic romance or candlelit castles. It rose from muddy graveyards, from plague-stricken hamlets, and from a world where death was unpredictable, intimate, and terrifyingly close. In early Slavic belief, death was not an absolute end. It was a threshold, and not everyone crossed it cleanly. The Upír was the one who failed to pass through. A corpse that refused to decay. Descriptions of the Upír were disturbingly physical. Unlike the pale, skeletal undead of later horror, the Upír was often described as bloated, ruddy, and swollen with stolen life. Its skin appeared stretched and flushed, its mouth sometimes smeared with fresh blood. When graves were opened, villagers claimed the body looked healthier than it had in life, an impossible and horrifying sight. To the medieval Slavic mind, this was proof of feeding. The Upír did not always drink blood as modern vampires do. Instead, it drained life force, causing illness, wasting sickness, and sudden death. Livestock would weaken and die first. Then family members. Entire households could perish one by one, convincing survivors that something dead was still feeding among them. Who became an Upír? Not everyone was at risk of becoming an Upír. Folklore named specific conditions that marked a person as vulnerable to undeath. Those who died violently or unnaturally. People who lived immoral or socially transgressive lives. Unbaptized individuals. Those born with physical signs, such as teeth, extra nipples, or being born with a caul. Victims of suicide or witchcraft. Even improper burial could doom a soul. A corpse buried without ritual, protection, or community acknowledgement might fail to rest and return. In this way, the Upír myth enforced social and religious order. To live outside the rules was to risk becoming a threat even after death. The night visitor. The Upír did not glide seductively through moonlit halls. It lurched, crawled, or moved with animal hunger, often appearing at night near its former home. Some accounts describe it knocking on doors or calling out names. Those who answered were said to fall ill shortly after. Others claimed the Upír moved invisibly, slipping into homes like breath itself. Victims awoke exhausted, pale, and feverish, wasting away until death claimed them. In an age without germ theory, the Upír became a living explanation for contagious disease. Plagues, tuberculosis, and sudden epidemics all fed the legend. Community fear and collective action. What makes the Upír especially significant is that its destruction was rarely an individual act. It required community consensus. When deaths mounted, villagers gathered, debated, and eventually chose a suspect. Graves were opened in daylight, often in the presence of elders or clergy. If the corpse appeared undecayed, bloated, or blooded, it was declared an Upír. The methods used to stop it were brutal, but symbolic. A wooden stake driven through the chest or stomach. Decapitation, with the head placed between the legs. Burning the body completely. Reburial with iron objects, stones, or poppy seeds. These acts were not seen as violence against the dead, but as defense of the living. The Upír was no longer considered human. It was a contagion. The sound of the undead. Some Slavic legends claim the Upír made animalistic noises, growls, smacking sounds, or heavy breathing. Others described a strange phenomenon, the corpse appearing to move or cry out when staked. Modern science explains this through decomposition gases and muscle contraction. Medieval villagers saw it as proof the creature was alive. Fear made witnesses of everyone. From folklore to history. By the 17th and 18th centuries, reports of Upír-like beings began to appear in official records across Eastern Europe. Austrian and Serbian authorities documented exhumations, autopsies, and testimonies from terrified villagers. What shocked Western scholars was not the superstition, but the consistency of the accounts. Bodies described as bloated. Blood at the mouth. Flexible limbs. No sign of decay. These reports ignited what historians now call the European vampire panic, and the Upír stood at its center. The origin of the word vampire. The term Upír, also Upír, Upír, is widely considered the linguistic ancestor of the modern word vampire. As reports spread westward, the name changed, but the creature remained the same. It was only later, through literature and romantic reinterpretation, that the Upír transformed into the aristocratic predator we recognize today. The original was far more disturbing. A reflection of human fear. The Upír represents something deeply human, the fear that death is not the end, and that those closest to us may become our greatest threat. It reflects anxiety about disease, social deviance, improper rituals, and the fragile order of village life. This was a world where everyone knew the dead personally. To imagine them returning was unbearable. And yet, the belief persisted for centuries. Because the Upír was not just a monster, it was an explanation. A way to name the invisible forces stealing life in the night. A story that gave shape to fear when science had no answers. Long before Dracula, long before fiction softened the undead, the Upír walked Europe's soil, bloated, hungry, and terrifyingly familiar. The Strigoi, Romanian undead. In the shadowed villages of Romania, where the Carpathian mountains rise like ancient sentinels and mist clings to the forests long after dawn, the boundary between the living and the dead was never secure. Long before Transylvania became synonymous with Dracula, the people of these lands feared something far older and far more personal, the Strigoi. Unlike the distant monsters of legend, the Strigoi was often believed to be a family member, a neighbor, or a child born under an ill-fated sign. It was not the terror of the unknown that haunted Romanian folklore, but the terror of recognition. The word Strigoi is believed to derive from the Latin strix, meaning a night owl or screeching demon, a creature associated with blood drinking and infant death in ancient Roman belief. Over centuries, this idea fused with local traditions, Christian theology, and pre-Christian ancestor worship, forming one of Europe's most complex vampire figures. The Strigoi was not a single creature, but a category of cursed existence, one that could walk among the living, die, and then return. Romanian folklore distinguishes between two primary forms, Strigoi Viu, the living Strigoi, and Strigoi Mort, the dead Strigoi. This distinction is crucial, because it reveals how vampirism was understood not merely as a post-mortem condition, but as a lifelong curse. A Strigoi Viu appeared outwardly human. They married, worked, and lived within the community, often unaware of their own nature. Yet they were believed to drain vitality from those around them, livestock growing thin, children falling ill, crops failing without explanation. Some legends claim they unconsciously left their bodies at night, their spirits slipping free to gather strength or battle other Strigoi in the unseen world. This idea reflects an ancient belief that the soul could wander during sleep, leaving the body vulnerable and morally unstable. Upon death, the Strigoi Viu often transformed into a Strigoi Mort, the most feared form of the undead. These revenants were said to rise from their graves under the cover of darkness, returning to their former homes. Unlike later literary vampires, the Strigoi did not stalk strangers. It fed first on its own family, spouses, children, siblings, draining blood, breath, or spiritual essence. This intimacy made the terror unbearable. The home, once a place of safety, became a hunting ground. Strigoi were blamed for a wide range of misfortunes, mysterious illnesses, infertility, repeated deaths within the same household, even prolonged droughts. When a village suffered multiple losses in quick succession, suspicion often fell upon the most recent corpse. If the dead appeared too well preserved, bloated, or flushed with color when exhumed, this was seen as undeniable proof of vampirism. Modern science explains these signs as natural effects of decomposition, yet for medieval villagers, they were evidence of nocturnal feeding. Fear of the Strigoi shaped everyday behavior. Protective measures were woven into domestic life, garlic hung above doors and windows, iron objects placed near beds, and thorny branches laid across graves. Newborns were baptized quickly to prevent them from becoming living Strigoi, and unusual births, such as children born with a caul, extra nipples, or teeth, were regarded with suspicion. These markers were not random, they reflected anxiety about deviation from the norm in a world where survival depended on conformity. The destruction of a Strigoi Mort was a grim communal ritual. Graves were opened in daylight, often in the presence of elders, priests, and family members. A wooden stake, sometimes hawthorn or ash, was driven through the heart or abdomen. In some regions, the heart was removed and burned, its ashes mixed with water and given to surviving relatives as a protective remedy. Decapitation, cremation, or reburial facedown were also practiced. These acts were not performed out of cruelty, but out of desperation. The Strigoi represented death that refused to stay contained. Christian belief both shaped and conflicted with Strigoi lore. While the Church officially condemned belief in revenants, priests were often called upon to bless graves, perform exorcisms, or oversee executions of the undead. The Strigoi thus existed in a liminal space, part pagan curse, part Christian moral warning. Sinners, liars, oathbreakers, and those who lived outside the church were all considered more likely to return as Strigoi. Vampirism became a moral consequence as much as a supernatural one. What makes the Strigoi particularly disturbing is how closely it reflects social trauma. High infant mortality, frequent epidemics, and limited medical knowledge meant death was constant and unpredictable. When entire families died one after another, the idea that a loved one was feeding upon the rest offered an explanation that was both terrifying and controllable. By destroying the Strigoi, the community reclaimed a sense of order. As vampire panic spread through Eastern Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries, the Strigoi became one of the primary sources for Western accounts of vampirism. Travelers, scholars, and officials recorded Romanian practices with fascination and horror. These reports traveled across Europe, influencing literature, philosophy, and eventually fiction. Without the Strigoi, there would be no Dracula, no aristocratic vampire stalking the night. Yet the folkloric Strigoi remains far darker than its literary descendant. The Strigoi does not seduce. It does not rule from a castle. It returns home. In Romanian folklore, the greatest horror was never the monster lurking in distant forests, but the one that knew your name, slept in your bed, and rose from the earth wearing a familiar face. The Strigoi endures because it embodies a fear that transcends time, the fear that death does not always end relationships, and that love itself can become a doorway for the undead. The Vrykolakas, Greek revenant. On the sun-bleached islands of Greece, where white stone villages cling to cliffs above the Aegean Sea, death was once feared not as an ending, but as a delay. Among the most dreaded figures of Greek folklore was the Vrykolakas, a revenant born not of distant wilderness, but of the village itself. Unlike the romantic vampire of later fiction, the Vrykolakas was a corpse that refused to decay, a body rejected by both earth and heaven. The belief in the Vrykolakas flourished during the Byzantine and Ottoman periods, particularly on isolated islands such as Santorini, Crete, and Chios. These communities lived close to one another, bound by tradition, faith, and rumor. When death struck repeatedly, or when bodies in the grave showed signs of unnatural preservation, suspicion spread quickly. A Vrykolakas was not merely a monster, it was proof that something had gone terribly wrong. Born of sin, curse, and excommunication. According to Greek belief, a Vrykolakas was often created through spiritual contamination. Those who were excommunicated by the Orthodox Church, lived immoral lives, practiced sorcery, or committed acts against divine law were at risk. Foreigners, heretics, or those buried without proper rites were especially vulnerable. Even a violent death could prevent the soul from departing cleanly, anchoring it to the flesh. Unlike Slavic vampires who rose to drink blood, the Vrykolakas existed in a liminal state, neither fully alive nor properly dead. The body remained strangely intact, sometimes swollen, with ruddy skin and flexible limbs. To the villagers, this lack of decay was not natural preservation but a sign of spiritual rejection. The earth itself would not accept the corpse. The knocking at the door. One of the most chilling aspects of Vrykolakas lore was its method of killing. At night, the revenant was said to wander through the village, knocking on doors and calling out names. If a person answered, whether out of fear, politeness, or confusion, they would fall ill within days and soon die. Those who survived learned the grim rule: never answer a knock after sunset. This detail served a practical purpose as well. In an age without modern medicine, isolating the sick and avoiding night contact helped slow the spread of disease. Folklore, in this sense, functioned as survival instruction disguised as terror. The Vrykolakas did not always drink blood. In many accounts, it crushed its victims, suffocated them, or drained their life force simply through proximity. Its presence alone was enough to bring sickness, infertility, and misfortune upon the household. A monster of the community. What made the Vrykolakas especially terrifying was its familiarity. It was not a stranger from the forest, it was a neighbor, a relative, a former friend. Often, the revenant returned to its own home, sat at the family table, or lingered outside familiar doors. This collapse of trust turned grief into paranoia. Anyone who died suspiciously might become the next threat. Entire villages participated in identifying suspected Vrykolakas. When deaths mounted, graves were opened. A body that appeared too well preserved, bloated, or blooded around the mouth confirmed their worst fears. Modern science explains these signs as natural decomposition processes, but to pre-modern eyes, they were undeniable proof of the undead. The role of the Orthodox Church. Unlike Western vampire lore, Greek beliefs were deeply shaped by Orthodox Christianity. Priests were central figures in both the identification and destruction of Vrykolakas. Exorcisms, prayers, and blessings were often attempted first. If these failed, harsher measures followed. One of the most extreme solutions was burning the corpse, an act usually reserved as a last resort. Because cremation conflicted with Orthodox burial practices, it symbolized total spiritual severance. Often, the body was transported to a deserted island or remote location before being burned, ensuring the revenant could never return. In some cases, the heart was removed, the body decapitated, or heavy stones placed in the grave to pin the corpse down. These acts were not driven by cruelty, but by fear of communal annihilation. Disease, isolation, and fear. The rise of Vrykolakas legends coincided with periods of plague, famine, and foreign occupation. During outbreaks, entire households could perish within weeks. Without understanding contagion, people searched for patterns, and the undead provided an explanation. Island life intensified this fear. With limited space and resources, death spread quickly. Isolation turned rumor into certainty. A single unexplained preservation could condemn a corpse, and its family, to suspicion. Foreign travelers during the 17th and 18th centuries documented these beliefs with fascination and horror. Their writings carried the Vrykolakas legend beyond Greece, influencing European vampire discourse and feeding the growing obsession with the undead. Between vampire and revenant. The Vrykolakas occupies a unique place in vampire mythology. It is not always a blood drinker, nor always nocturnal. Some accounts claim it could walk in daylight. Others describe it as more spirit than flesh. This ambiguity reflects its role as a revenant, a being defined not by hunger, but by unresolved death. In this way, the Vrykolakas is closer to a walking curse than a predator. It embodies the idea that a broken relationship with faith, community, or burial rites could doom a soul to wander endlessly. Legacy of the Greek revenant. Though belief in the Vrykolakas has faded, its shadow remains in modern vampire lore. The idea of the undead spreading death without biting, the fear of improper burial, and the role of religion in defining monstrosity all trace back to Greek tradition. More importantly, the Vrykolakas reveal something deeply human, the terror of dying incorrectly. Not just dying, but dying without forgiveness, without ritual, without belonging. The Nachzehrer, the vampire that fed from the grave. In the shadowed villages of medieval Germany, not all vampires walked the night. Some never left their graves at all. These were the Nachzehrer, a name that translates chillingly as after-devourer, a being believed to consume life not by roaming the countryside, but by feeding from within its coffin. Silent, unseen, and relentless, the Nachzehrer embodied a uniquely intimate terror, the idea that death itself could reach upward from the earth and drag the living down with it. Unlike the dramatic revenants of later legend, the Nachzehrer was not known for blood drinking or midnight attacks. Its power was subtle. As it gnawed on its burial shroud, its own flesh, or even its coffin, sickness spread among those it had left behind. Families weakened. Livestock died. Entire households vanished one by one. The vampire never appeared, yet its presence was felt everywhere. The belief in the Nachzehrer flourished during periods of plague, famine, and war, when death moved quickly and explanation lagged behind. When several members of the same family died in succession, villagers assumed a supernatural cause. Someone, already buried, was still feeding. Graves were reopened. What villagers saw only confirmed their fears. A corpse that would not stay still. When suspected Nachzehrer graves were exhumed, the bodies often appeared disturbingly alive. The corpse might be bloated, the skin stretched and darkened, the mouth open as if mid-chew. In some accounts, blood was said to be visible around the lips, and fingernails appeared to have grown. Modern science explains these signs as natural processes of decomposition. Gases build up inside the body, causing bloating. Skin retracts, making nails and teeth appear longer. Fluids can escape through the mouth and nose. But to medieval villagers, these were unmistakable signs of feeding. The most terrifying detail was the shroud itself. Burial cloths were sometimes found torn, shredded, or drawn into the corpse's mouth. This was interpreted as the Nachzehrer literally consuming its burial garments, and through a form of sympathetic magic, devouring the life force of its family above ground. Each bite taken in the coffin meant another death in the household. Who became a Nachzehrer? Not everyone was at risk of becoming a Nachzehrer. Folklore outlined specific signs that marked a person as dangerous even after death. Those born with teeth, known as Totenfresser in some regions, were especially feared. A child who emerged from the womb already biting was believed destined to feed from the grave. Improper burial was another major cause. If a corpse was buried without the correct rites, placed face up, or interred too quickly, it might fail to rest. Suicide victims, unbaptized individuals, and those who died during epidemics were particularly suspect. In some German regions, animals passing over a grave, especially cats or dogs, were believed to awaken the corpse within. Once disturbed, the Nachzehrer would begin its slow feast. These beliefs reveal an underlying anxiety about death rituals. The community's survival depended on getting burial right. A single mistake could doom the living. Feeding without leaving the grave. The Nachzehrer's method of attack was deeply symbolic. It did not hunt strangers. It consumed its own kin. As it fed in the coffin, family members began to waste away. They grew pale, weak, and feverish. Coughing blood was a particularly ominous sign, reinforcing the belief that the vampire was draining life itself. Tuberculosis, which spreads through close contact and often affects households sequentially, was later nicknamed the vampire disease for this very reason. To the medieval mind, the connection was obvious. The dead were feeding. The living were being eaten. What made the Nachzehrer especially terrifying was its invisibility. There was no creature to fight, no monster to spot in the woods. The danger lay underground, close, familiar, and unstoppable unless discovered. Preventing the after-devourer. German folklore developed detailed preventative measures to stop a Nachzehrer before it could begin feeding. One common practice was placing a coin, stone, or clod of earth into the corpse's mouth. This gave the dead something to chew, distracting it from consuming its shroud, or the living. Another method involved binding the jaw shut with cloth or wire. In some regions, the head was removed entirely and placed between the corpse's legs. Burial face down was also practiced, ensuring that if the corpse awoke, it would dig deeper into the earth rather than rise. In extreme cases, exhumed corpses were decapitated, burned, or reburied at crossroads, places believed to confuse or trap restless spirits. These acts were not considered desecration, but emergency rituals, last lines of defense against annihilation. Such practices were often carried out publicly, reinforcing social cohesion. The village confronted death together. Fear beneath the fear. At its core, the Nachzehrer myth reflects a profound fear of contagion. Unlike roaming vampires, this creature spread death silently, through family lines, without visible cause. It transformed grief into suspicion and forced communities to confront the uncomfortable reality that death itself might not be contained. The idea that a loved one could unknowingly destroy those they cared for most added a psychological horror absent from later vampire fiction. The Nachzehrer was not evil by intent, it fed because it could not stop. This made it more frightening, not less. Legacy of the grave feeder. Though the Nachzehrer never achieved the fame of Dracula, its influence can be seen throughout European vampire lore. The emphasis on burial rituals, mouth binding, and the idea of post-mortem feeding appears across Slavic and Balkan traditions. Most importantly, the Nachzehrer reminds us that early vampires were not born from romance or seduction, but from disease, misunderstanding, and the desperate human need to explain mass death. The Alp, nightmare vampire of the night. In the dense forests and misty villages of medieval Germany, the fear of the dead was not always tied to graves or corpses. Sometimes, terror came in the form of the living, unseen, and nocturnal. One of the most haunting figures of European folklore is the Alp, a creature that defied the familiar rules of life and death. Unlike the Upír of the Slavs or the Strigoi of Romania, the Alp was not buried in the ground, nor did it require a violent death to rise. Instead, it preyed on the living while they slept, a predator of the mind and body, leaving terror and exhaustion in its wake. The Alp was often described as a small, humanoid figure with a grotesque or distorted face, sometimes appearing as a shadowy imp or goblin. Its eyes could glow in the dark, or in other tales, be hidden beneath a strange cap that contained its power. This cap, often called a tarn cap, was said to make the Alp invisible, allowing it to slip silently into homes. Villagers believed it could transform into animals, cats, dogs, or even birds, granting it mobility and versatility as it hunted its victims. Most terrifyingly, the Alp attacked people in their sleep. It would sit upon the chest of the sleeper, pressing down with an unbearable weight, causing breathing difficulties, hallucinations, and the sense of suffocation. Modern scholars now recognize these symptoms as descriptions of sleep paralysis, a natural condition in which the mind awakens before the body, leaving the person conscious but unable to move. Yet in a world where scientific explanations were absent, the Alp became a nightmarish figure that could strike anyone, regardless of wealth, virtue, or social standing. Accounts of Alp attacks often share a common pattern. The victim would awaken unable to move, feel a crushing weight on their chest, see a small, grotesque figure or shadow looming over them, and suffer from vivid hallucinations of strangulation or threat. After such attacks, exhaustion, fever, or even death could follow, particularly among the weak or elderly. Families believed these symptoms were the result of the Alp feeding on their vitality, stealing their energy as a vampire would its blood. The origins of the Alp legend are complex, entwined with the fears and superstitions of the Germanic world. It was often associated with witches, particularly those who had made pacts with dark spirits or practiced forbidden magic. Some believed that certain people were born with the power of the Alp, able to project their spirit in the night to feed upon others, while others could be cursed to become an Alp after death or through exposure to malevolent forces. In this sense, the Alp blurred the lines between demon, ghost, and vampire. It was simultaneously a supernatural being, a reflection of human fear, and an explanation for natural yet terrifying phenomena. Communities developed various protective measures against the Alp. One of the most common involved manipulating the physical environment of sleep. Placing shoes backward by the bed, keeping iron objects near the sleeper, or laying a broom across the doorway could prevent an Alp from entering. Mirrors and windows were also strategically used to confuse or repel the creature. Some rituals involved turning the bed over, changing the orientation of the household, or even using charms and prayers to disrupt the Alp's power. These practices were not mere superstition, they were strategies for survival in a world where a sleepless night could easily lead to illness or death. The Alp also had a curious duality. It was feared, but it could sometimes be domesticated or appeased. Certain villagers believed that by leaving offerings, milk, bread, or small gifts, the Alp could be pacified, preventing it from attacking. In some regions, tales describe cunning individuals negotiating with the Alp or even using its abilities for their own benefit, sending it to harass enemies while protecting themselves. This dimension of folklore reveals how the Alp was both a threat and a tool, demonstrating the flexibility of European myth in addressing social and personal anxieties. Anthropologists and folklorists have noted that the Alp may have been an attempt to understand the terrifying experience of sleep paralysis, night terrors, and sudden death in children or the infirm. Before science could explain these phenomena, they were attributed to the interference of a sentient, malevolent force. The Alp gave shape to the unseen dangers of the night, offering a narrative that allowed communities to protect themselves, however imperfectly. The legend of the Alp also illuminates cultural attitudes toward vulnerability and the unseen. In a medieval world where the household was central to survival, sleep represented both rest and exposure. The Alp embodied the fears of invasion, disease, and unseen predation. It was not enough to guard the fields, doors, or livestock, one also had to guard the human body itself, even in its most vulnerable state. Throughout Europe, variations of the Alp persisted in folklore, sometimes merging with local vampire beliefs or tales of witches and demons. In Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and even parts of the Netherlands, storytellers warned children and adults alike to be cautious when sleeping alone, to respect household rituals, and to honor the unseen forces of the night. These stories reinforced social cohesion and taught practical strategies for survival while weaving a tapestry of fear, mystery, and the supernatural that continues to fascinate modern audiences. In modern media, echoes of the Alp appear in tales of succubi, shadowy intruders, and creatures that feed on sleep. Its influence is subtle yet pervasive, connecting the nocturnal fears of medieval Europe to contemporary horror. The Alp reminds us that not all vampires rise from graves. Some stalk the living quietly, unseen, leaving exhaustion, terror, and sometimes death in their wake. In the Alp is more than a myth, it is a reflection of human vulnerability. It embodies the intersection of fear, imagination, and the inexplicable forces that governed everyday life in medieval Europe. By understanding the Alp, we gain insight into a world where the boundary between life and death, sleep and wakefulness, the natural and the supernatural, was perilously thin. The Alp stands as a testament to the creativity of folklore, the universality of nighttime fear, and the enduring human need to explain the unexplainable. As night falls and shadows lengthen, the legend whispers still, beware the unseen visitor, for some vampires do not wait in graves, they sit on your chest while you dream. The Bruxa, Iberian witch vampire. In the rugged landscapes of Portugal and northern Spain, folklore carried whispers of a creature as feared as any vampire in Europe, yet strikingly different from the Slavic Upír or the Romanian Strigoi. This was the Bruxa, a being that blurred the line between witchcraft and vampirism. The Bruxa was not simply a dead body returned to life, nor a revenant rising from its grave. Instead, it was often a living person, sometimes an elderly woman, sometimes a solitary outcast, capable of transforming into a predator that fed on blood, vitality, or the life force of the living. Unlike the archetypal image of the vampire as a corpse-like figure, the Bruxa thrived in secrecy. She could appear as any ordinary person during the day, blending into the life of a village, yet at night, she transformed. Accounts describe her taking the form of a bird, a bat, or even a shadow, slipping unseen through chimneys and cracks to suck the blood of children, the weak, or those who had offended her in life. Unlike Slavic or Romanian vampires, whose victims were often random or tied to family and community, the Bruxa's attacks were deeply personal, reflecting grudges, envy, or accusations of witchcraft. Historical records show that the belief in the Bruxa reached its peak between the 16th and 18th centuries, a period when superstition, religious orthodoxy, and social tension coexisted uneasily in Iberian societies. Villagers lived in constant fear of nocturnal attacks, and suspicion often fell on women who lived alone, practiced herbal medicine, or otherwise defied societal norms. These women were frequently accused of being Bruxas, whether or not they had any connection to witchcraft. In many ways, the Bruxa myth served as a tool of social control, targeting the marginalized and reinforcing the authority of church and community. One of the most striking aspects of the Bruxa legend is her connection to the idea of transformation and mobility. Unlike other vampires tied to graves, the Bruxa could move freely, crossing distances impossible for a corpse-bound revenant. In stories, she would fly over rooftops, visit sleeping children, or attack livestock from the skies. The ability to transform into a bird or a bat symbolized her otherworldly nature, but it also reflected deep societal anxieties about the unpredictability of evil. The danger could strike anywhere, at any time, and no physical barrier could stop it. Protective measures against the Bruxa were as inventive as they were desperate. Families would place iron implements, garlic, or holy symbols near windows and doorways. Some accounts describe villagers keeping watch through the night, armed with crosses or charms, to prevent attacks. In particularly severe cases, the Bruxa was said to be destroyed using ritualistic methods, burning her belongings, staking her heart, or even exhuming suspected bodies after death to ensure she could not rise as a vampire in the traditional sense. Interestingly, these precautions often mirrored those used against other vampires, demonstrating the shared cultural logic of fear across Europe. The Bruxa also illustrates the interweaving of witchcraft and vampirism in Iberian folklore. In the early modern period, the Catholic Church vigorously prosecuted witchcraft, and accusations often included vampiric activity. A woman accused of being a Bruxa might face interrogation about nocturnal flights, animal transformations, or feeding on blood. These trials created a feedback loop. The more villagers believed in the Bruxa, the more accusations followed, solidifying her place in folklore. In essence, the Bruxa became both a supernatural threat and a human scapegoat, embodying the collective fears of communities struggling with disease, mortality, and social instability. Yet, there was more to the Bruxa than terror. In some stories, she was also a healer and protector, a figure who walked a fine line between benevolence and malevolence. A skilled midwife or herbalist might be revered for her knowledge, but the same skill could cast suspicion if misfortune struck. This duality reflects the complex nature of Iberian society. Women wielded power through knowledge, yet that power was constantly scrutinized and feared. The Bruxa, therefore, is not just a vampire or a witch, she is a reflection of social dynamics, gender roles, and the human need to personify and understand danger. The Bruxa's influence extended beyond Iberia. Through colonization and migration, stories of the Bruxa traveled to the Americas, particularly to Brazil and parts of the Caribbean, where local traditions merged with the myth. Here, the Bruxa took on new forms, blending with indigenous beliefs about spirits and the dead. In some regions, she remained a nocturnal predator, while in others, she became associated more with curses and witchcraft than with literal blood drinking. This evolution highlights the adaptability of vampire myths and their capacity to absorb local fears and customs. In literature and modern media, the Bruxa is often overshadowed by more famous vampires, yet her story is no less compelling. She represents vampirism rooted in the living world, a predator who can blend into society, act with intent, and wield both fear and influence. Unlike the Slavic or Romanian undead, who are bound to death, the Bruxa embodies the idea that evil can walk among us, invisible and unpredictable. This makes her one of the most psychologically complex figures in European folklore, bridging the supernatural and the human. Finally, the Bruxa reminds us that vampire myths are not uniform. They are shaped by culture, geography, and social structure. While the Slavic Upír terrifies through grotesque physicality and the Strigoi through familial vengeance, the Bruxa terrifies through proximity and cunning. Her legend reflects deep human anxieties about morality, female power, and the boundaries between life and death. She is a vampire that cannot be locked in a grave, a predator who turns society itself into a hunting ground. The Bruxa, therefore, is more than an Iberian vampire. She is a mirror of human fear, ingenuity, and the dark imagination that gave rise to the vampire archetype across Europe. As we explore her story, we see how folklore, superstition, and social norms intertwine, creating a creature that is as much a reflection of humanity as it is of the supernatural. And in her nocturnal flights across shadowed rooftops, the Bruxa reminds us that the dead, or the cursed, are never far from our fears. The Moroi, born vampire. In the shadowed villages of Romania, long before the modern notion of vampires entered literature, the Moroi haunted the fears of families and priests alike. Unlike the Strigoi, whose existence was often linked to untimely or violent deaths, the Moroi was believed to be born with a curse, a creature whose destiny to drain life began long before its first breath. Tales of the Moroi reflect a society obsessed with the tenuous boundary between the sacred and the profane, life and death, and the vulnerability of the young and innocent in a world where superstition governed daily existence. The origins of the Moroi were shrouded in dread. It was widely believed that certain circumstances surrounding birth could mark a child as destined to become a Moroi. A child born out of wedlock, or the offspring of a mother who had been excommunicated, sinful, or unbaptized, might carry the invisible taint of vampirism. In some accounts, even being born with a caul, the thin membrane sometimes covering a newborn's head, was interpreted as a sign of otherworldly powers. Unlike the Upír or Strigoi, whose powers were activated by death, the Moroi's essence was present from birth, simmering like a hidden poison within a seemingly normal infant. Communities lived in constant vigilance. Parents would watch their newborns carefully, interpreting every cough, pallor, or restless night as potential proof of a dark destiny. Midwives were often both healers and mediators, performing rituals to ensure a child's survival against supernatural harm. In many regions, a newborn suspected of being a Moroi might be protected with charms, herbs, or religious symbols, each intended to ward off the evil that had taken residence before the child had even drawn its first breath. Garlic, iron, and sacred water were not only protective, they were talismans in a broader spiritual battle, one waged quietly in every household and whispered in every church. The Moroi, as folklore tells it, did not always resemble the grotesque image of the later vampire. In life, it often appeared as a normal child, or a young person of slight build and unusual pallor. But its hunger for life force, not always literal blood, could manifest in subtle ways. Family members might grow increasingly ill without explanation, livestock might weaken, and neighbors might die suddenly. The living were taught to observe patterns carefully. A child who never seemed to thrive, who brought misfortune wherever it went, might be a Moroi in waiting. Sometimes, the mere fear of this hidden curse could fracture families, as superstition outweighed familial bonds. Death did not end the Moroi's influence. When such a child eventually died, whether young or in adulthood, the curse could awaken fully. The corpse might rise, returning to the village to prey on the living, particularly targeting those most familiar, often family members. Villagers described signs of this transformation. The corpse appeared unnaturally preserved, the flesh supple rather than decomposing, the body moved of its own accord, and fresh blood could be found around the mouth. In extreme accounts, the Moroi could travel in spirit form even before death, leaving the body behind at night to torment and drain vitality from others. The Moroi's activities were feared as much for their subtlety as their violence. Unlike the more obvious Strigoi, who might attack openly, the Moroi could undermine life quietly, like a shadow creeping through the household. Sleep deprivation, sickness, and sudden misfortune were often attributed to the hidden hand of this newborn curse, and rituals of protection became essential to prevent escalation. One popular method involved placing iron or silver objects beneath the child's pillow, believed to prevent the spirit from feeding. Others included marking thresholds with crosses, suspending garlic in windows, or inviting priests to bless the child repeatedly. These practices reflected a complex intersection of folklore, theology, and social order, where the spiritual safety of the village rested on vigilance over the most vulnerable members. Scholars suggest that the Moroi myth may have been a cultural explanation for infant mortality, stillbirths, or hereditary disease, conditions that were otherwise incomprehensible in pre-modern Europe. When a child was weak, sickly, or died unexpectedly, folklore offered a narrative to explain the inexplicable, often in ways that reinforced religious and social norms. Baptism, exorcism, and community involvement were not merely spiritual rituals, they were also psychological frameworks for coping with grief and fear. In a world where science had not yet illuminated the causes of disease, superstition shaped reality, and the Moroi became both a scapegoat and a warning. Accounts of dealing with a Moroi varied regionally. In some Romanian villages, suspected Moroi corpses were treated with extreme caution. They might be exhumed shortly after death, with their heart pierced or their body burned to prevent any posthumous activity. In other regions, the focus was preventative. The living could be vaccinated against the curse through blessings, prayers, and ritual safeguards. Folklore emphasizes that the Moroi's threat was not only physical, but deeply social, destabilizing families, eroding trust, and challenging the community's spiritual integrity. One of the most haunting aspects of the Moroi legend is its reflection of ancestral fear and inherited guilt. Unlike vampires created by sin in life or violent death, the Moroi's curse suggests a world in which wrongdoing, real or imagined, could transcend generations. Children were born under suspicion, and entire lineages could carry the burden of superstition. The myth instilled an acute awareness that actions, faith, and morality had consequences far beyond a single lifetime. Despite its ancient roots, the Moroi continues to influence vampire lore. Modern literature and media often depict vampires as born with innate powers, predestined to prey upon humanity, echoing the fears embedded in this Romanian legend. Yet the original Moroi was not a glamorous figure. It was a cautionary symbol, a reflection of society's anxieties about inheritance, mortality, and the fragility of life. In the Moroi legend offers more than frightful tales, it offers insight into how humans historically understood life, death, and the unseen forces shaping both. These stories, preserved in rural folklore and ecclesiastical records, reveal a profound interplay between fear, morality, and survival, and remind us that the dead were never simply dead. They could carry the consequences of both the living and the unborn. The Moroi is thus one of Europe's most chilling vampire archetypes, a creature born not from death alone, but from the anxieties, hopes, and fears that communities projected onto the vulnerable. Its story is a reminder that folklore serves not only to entertain or scare but also to explain, to warn, and to preserve the memory of a society's deepest uncertainties about life and the afterlife. The Croatian vampire panic. In the early 18th century, reports began trickling from the villages of Croatia and Serbia that would shock all of Europe. Families whispered of corpses rising from their graves, returning to torment the living. These stories were not mere superstition, they became the subject of official investigations, documented in church and governmental records. For the first time, the fear of vampires had escalated into a continental phenomenon, a panic that would capture the imagination of scholars, clergy, and common folk alike, bridging folklore and what would later become the modern vampire myth. The panic began in the small town of Kiseljevo, in the Banat region of Serbia, with the death of a man named Petar Blagojevic in 1725. According to local reports, Blagojevic had lived a relatively unremarkable life. He was a husband, a father, and a farmer, but in death, he would become a legend. Shortly after his burial, villagers claimed that he appeared at night, standing by their doors, sometimes scratching at windows, sometimes sitting near the hearth. Those who encountered him allegedly fell ill shortly afterward, some dying in agony. Fear spread quickly. The dead man, it seemed, had returned to feed on the living. Alarmed by the intensity of the rumors, local authorities exhumed Blagojevic's body. Witnesses reported that the corpse was unusually well preserved, the skin ruddy and taut, the hair still growing, and the mouth smeared with blood. Such observations confirmed, in the eyes of the terrified villagers, that the dead man was indeed a vampire, a being that defied death and sought to drain life from the living. Clergy were consulted, and a consensus emerged: the corpse must be destroyed. Petar Blagojevic's body was staked through the heart, burned, and the ashes scattered. Only then did the village feel a measure of relief, though whispers of other vampires soon followed. The panic did not remain confined to Kisiljevo. Across Croatia, Serbia, and parts of Hungary, similar accounts emerged. One of the most famous cases involved Arnold Pauli, a soldier whose story would later be detailed in Austrian reports. Pauli had reportedly been cursed by a vampire during his military service in the Ottoman territories. After his death in 1726, villagers reported seeing him rise from the grave to attack the living. Accounts describe a frightening pattern: corpses found with fresh blood in their mouths, graves disturbed, and families falling ill one by one. Such cases led to widespread exhumations, with local magistrates and clergy supervising the destruction of suspected vampires. What is striking about the Croatian vampire panic is the meticulous detail recorded in these investigations. Austrian officials, eager to prevent panic from spreading to their territories, sent physicians and church representatives to document the phenomena. They recorded the condition of exhumed bodies, noting bloating, livid skin, and displaced limbs, natural signs of decomposition that, to the villagers' eyes, were proof of the undead. These reports reveal a fascinating intersection of folk belief and early scientific observation, where superstition was taken seriously enough to warrant bureaucratic scrutiny. The panic also illustrates the cultural factors that allowed vampire beliefs to flourish. Rural communities in the Balkans were often isolated, with high mortality rates from disease, famine, and conflict. Death was common, but mysterious illnesses, especially those that appeared to strike families in sequence, demanded explanation. Folklore provided that explanation. Vampires, in this context, were not merely mythical, they were a way to understand and control the uncontrollable. Exhumation, staking, and burning became rituals of communal protection, a way to restore order and reaffirm the boundaries between life and death. Interestingly, the Croatian vampire panic also demonstrates how fear can spread like a contagion. Once one vampire was confirmed, other deaths were reinterpreted in its shadow. Ordinary decomposition or illness was framed as evidence of vampirism. Villagers would accuse recently deceased family members of being vampires, leading to multiple exhumations in the same community. Some accounts even describe groups of people attending these rituals, bearing torches and stakes, creating a vivid image of a society gripped by terror. Anthropologists suggest that this is one of the first instances of what modern psychologists call a moral panic, where collective fear escalates and becomes self-reinforcing. The Croatian vampire panic also played a pivotal role in the transmission of vampire legends to Western Europe. Reports published in newspapers and pamphlets across Austria, Germany, and England fascinated scholars and writers. Physicians like Michael Ranft, who penned De Mastication Mortuorum in Tumulis in 1728, analyzed these accounts, offering detailed treatises on vampire behavior, exhumation practices, and methods of destruction. Ranft's work combined folklore with medical observation, describing the vampire's supposed physical traits and habits, and emphasizing the contagious nature of their attacks. These publications would lay the groundwork for the vampire as a figure in literature, inspiring tales that eventually culminated in Bram Stoker's Dracula over a century later. Yet for all the sensational reports, modern historians and scientists point out that natural phenomena likely explain much of the panic. Bodies buried in shallow graves, interred during hot weather, often appear swollen or bloated due to gas formation. Blood seeping from the mouth or nose is a natural part of decomposition. Communities unfamiliar with these processes, combined with superstition and fear, interpreted them as supernatural evidence. Disease and malnutrition could further amplify the perception that the dead were attacking the living. Still, these explanations cannot diminish the cultural power of the belief. The fear itself shaped behavior, rituals, and even policy. The Croatian vampire panic left a lasting legacy. It marks the moment when the vampire shifted from obscure local folklore to a figure of European fascination. The panic was widely reported, studied, and debated, cementing the vampire's place in the collective imagination. It also highlights a fundamental truth about European folklore: vampires were never merely monsters of fiction, they were reflections of human fears, societal tensions, and the mysteries of death itself. By understanding the Croatian vampire panic, we glimpse a time when Europe's relationship with death was intensely personal and terrifying. Graves were not sacred resting places but sites of potential danger. Communities had to guard against the return of their loved ones, and fear dictated rituals, social behavior, and even governance. These undead legends, documented with care and horror, remind us that belief can be as powerful as reality, sometimes even more so. The panic ultimately waned as the Enlightenment spread scientific reasoning, yet its stories endured.